John White again, Luke 10, and this is the second of a series of 3 videos, part of the Leader 101 course, and this is lesson 7, where we're talking about cultivating the habit of attention paying and how important that is for within Luke 10. Again, with my friends Kent and Jordan, and so the second video is about the idea that attention paying is, it sounds like something really, really simple. And in one sense it is, but it's actually also a radical concept. Most Americans would affirm the idea that God is prevenient. He's always the initiator, always starting things. But the way that we've been taught to do ministry, at least for me, and I see that in many, many churches and ministries, actually lives in a whole different way. And Kent, sometimes we use the phrase a functional deism. So what exactly is that?
Well, it's more than we can talk about in the amount of time we have here, but in a really brief way, deism is just the belief that God is kind of the master clockmaker, wound the universe up, started everything, and then has largely been disengaged from the process and is sort of waiting to see how things play out. So it's deeply written into, especially the American psyche. It was a part of the philosophical undergirding of many of our founding fathers and mothers in America, and has been a deeply, it's really the water we drink and the air we breathe in a lot of ways. A sort of functional deism. God's not really that engaged in things as we know it, as we experience it. Lots of thoughtful people have observed this about how Americans function in relationship to God.
So most Christians would be horrified. Most Christian leaders would be horrified if somebody described them as a functional deist. But in fact, the way many churches and ministries operate is exactly that. It's like God has given us the objective, mission, Great Commission, different ways of saying it, but then it becomes our job to kind of figure out how to do that, and as you said, get her done, make it happen. It was very much part of my experience early on as a Christian. We had a very extensive process we would go through to kind of do ministry, figure out the needs, set the goals, create a program, and recruit the people, and implement the program. And by the way, we want to ask God to bless that. And as we're walking out the door, the leader, the pastor would say, make it happen. That phrase rings in my mind. Go out and make it happen. And what we're saying is that beginning with prevenience, we have a whole different dynamic going on here that really is radically different. Jordan, any thoughts on that?
I'll wait to chime in here.
Okay, good. One of the ways that this whole idea of what we call functional deism gets worked out, we think, has to do with this phrase missional church. We need to create a missional church. We need to be missional Christians. Kent, what does that typically involve?
Well, often it's driven by wonderful hearts with great motivation to go out and do something good for God. And one of the privileges of working with graduate students now for 25 years is I've gotten to see a lot of those marvelous people coming our way through seminary and through other programs that we work with here. The problem is that people who begin with that as their driver, go out and do something great for God, are often not very aware of either what God's up to, what they're capable of, or the realities of the context in which they find themselves. And so burnout is almost always, I've seen it over and over again, the outcome of living out of that sort of best guess about what God might be up to, based on my energy, my thoughtfulness, my creativity, etc., etc. So sometimes I encourage my graduate students to stop asking the question, what would Jesus do? No longer practice WWJD, but move to WIGD. What is God doing? What is God doing? Because ultimately what God is doing is what the missionally impactful thing is going to be in a given time and place with a given group of people. So what is God doing? I think becomes a really powerful alternative paradigm from, again, my best guess about what Jesus might do in a given context.
I first learned the word prevenience, which we're talking about here, from Eugene Peterson in his book, the Contemplative Pastor. I'll put some of my notes about that in the blog post. But this is exactly what he said: is that we've been trained that it's our responsibility to go make things happen. But he says prevenience requires that we, in any situation, we show up and we simply ask the question, what's God up to here? And is there a way that he wants me to join him in what he is doing, as opposed to what it is that I'm supposed to go make happen? And so with the missional church movement, they would often say, well, the purpose of church, or the purpose of our lives, is mission. And we kind of respond to that and saying, no, that's not the purpose. Mission is a byproduct of something else. And so we don't start with mission. That's something that happens pretty naturally and spontaneously as we focus on paying attention to what God preveniently is doing. Jordan, anything there?
Yeah. I think one of the real dangers with a missional church model that this idea of prevenience really protects against is a growing celebrity that's really kind of becoming a real problem in the American church. If God has just given us this mission and our job is to go out and get it done, then that's naturally going to create some superstars. And we've definitely seen that, and we've seen that go to people's heads, and we've seen that screw up a lot of churches and a lot of people that were following those superstars, and we're looking to those superstars and talking about, in some cases, talking about them and thinking about them and what they would do more than God and what He is doing, this idea of prevenience really makes that an almost impossibility. We have our roles. We have our we have our part to play in this, but there is only one superstar, and I think this idea of prevenience really, like I said, sort of almost makes that an impossibility of that becoming a problem in the church that is such a huge problem, I think, right now.
Yeah, that's a great insight, Jordan. So not only is this approach very simple, but it's something anybody can do. You don't have to be hugely gifted or brilliant kinds of people to do this. This is something every believer can learn how to do and to really live their life and do ministry out of that. One other place that we see this showing up, this functional deism idea, again, this is kind of our opinion, is in a lot of the popular discipleship programs that we see these days. Ken, can you make a comment about what typically that looks like, discipleship programs, as compared to this idea of starting with God's prevenience?
Yeah, I think probably most of the people watching this will be able to recall various kinds of discipleship programs that they have been through over the course of their lifetime, and maybe have conducted themselves in a lot of different occasions. And there certainly is value in that kind of thoughtful thinking through what do people need to learn, what do people need to know. But it can get really complicated. It can get really exhausting, and I think part of what happens when we don't start with paying attention to God and to what God is initiating in the lives of people around us is we create a learning model, a leadership model that basically is dedicated to pouring into whoever comes along more or less the same content, the same way, at the same time. And fundamentally, that's not how Jesus went about discipleship. And fundamentally, that doesn't work very well. And I think a lot of us have seen the downside of teaching on a just-in-case basis rather than teaching on a just-in-time basis. You know, I'm teaching this to you just in case you ever happen to need it, or just in case it becomes important to you sometime. But Jesus was the just-in-time teacher. He was the teacher who was dealing with the issues that the disciples were raising, with the struggles and the brokenness and the hurts of the people around him, as they arose, and as he attended to the Father and what the Holy Spirit was wanting to do, made that evident in the moment and in the process. And so it really is a fundamentally different approach to discipleship. Sometimes I tell my grad students, are asking the question, what does it mean to be a leader in a kingdom if you're not the king? What does it mean to be a leader in a household if you're not the head of that house? And I think that both of those questions point us to an issue that Jesus repeatedly raises, and the disciples after him raised in their writings and thinkings, namely that we are called to be stewards. Our role as leaders is to steward what God is up to, which means, again, to be attendants, right? To be paying attention to what God is doing, so that the role that we play actually contributes to what the leader of the household, the king, is actually up to. And if we shift our thinking in that direction, it makes life and teaching and disciple making a wonderful adventure that continues to call us back to attention every day and many times in the course of the day.
So this is one of those phrases. If you're watching this video, I would encourage you to write it down and think about it. Phrases that Kent has come up with, God's given him. What does it mean to be a leader in a kingdom if you're not the king? I mean, that is just like that. You can think about that one for a long time. And so you can see that one of the things that all of this affects hugely is the whole idea of education. It completely changes our view of education. And one of the things that happens is motivation goes way up. Because as I'm paying attention to what God is doing right now, that's something I'm concerned about, or I have questions about, or I'm interested in. And I think back to my seminary education, where it took me, I squeezed 3 years into 4, and there are all these classes where we're learning stuff, and I remember thinking at the time, first of all, I'm not very interested in this particular topic right now. And I would share that with my professors, and they would say, well, someday you're going to need this. And I remember, like, 5 years after seminary thinking, you know, I don't think they were really right. So education is totally different when you start with this idea of prevenience. Jordan, any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, as one of Kent's students, that was one of those statements that sort of rocked my world. As someone who really liked being a leader and but was wrestling with this new idea that that if Jesus was really king, if he's really head of the church, what does that mean for us? And I think that it's one of those things that shaped my life dramatically moving forward, and realizing that, okay, I still do have a part to play in this. Yes. Jesus does raise up leaders within his kingdom, but it's not the role of being the head of the church functionally. I think most church leaders would recognize that they're not the head of the church, but functionally, in many cases, it still looks that way. It still functions that way. And so understanding this new idea that we are, we are stewards of what God is doing is functionally, it plays itself out radically different, and in a way that really allows space for him to actually lead his church. which is pretty amazing.
It is, absolutely. A couple more comments I'll throw in there. Remember John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard movement, sharing the story that he was traveling, teaching about church growth and all that. And he said one night the Lord woke him up in the middle of the night. It was Detroit or someplace. And he said he heard the Lord speak to him, and the Lord said, John, I've seen your church. Now I'm going to show you my church. And totally changed John Wimber's whole thinking. He said he just broke into tears because he knew it was true. And so much of what we were trained as pastors, I was a pastor for 25 years, so much of what we were trained to do as pastors is how to build the church, start the church, build the church, all that kind of stuff. And this is a whole different way of thinking about that. Another phrase that I really appreciate from John Eldridge. He talked about, again, typical American Christianity as the gospel of knowledge and duty. So what do we see happening? We're always giving people more information, more knowledge, the gospel of knowledge, and then duty. The way we motivate people is out of shoulds and oughts and guilt. People are dying all around the world. People are dying. They're going to hell. What are you going to do about it? That kind of approach. And this is very different from that. Typical discipleship programs, as Kent said, are very complicated. You begin to get into it, and you find there are all these lessons and steps, and you just have this huge notebook of stuff that you're going to have to master. And when I think about Jesus, you don't see him walking around with this huge notebook. He had this complex program. But if you ask the question, how did Jesus know how to make disciples? I think you come back to the same question. Or the same answer. He listened to the Father, found out what the Father was doing, what the Father was saying, and he did that. And that's how he made disciples. And that's how we want to make disciples in the context of Luke 10. So we say, in a lot of ways, this idea of prevenience and attention paying is like a whole different operating system from what a lot of us grew up with. And this is what we're excited about passing on. So this is video 2. In video 3, we're going to talk more about practical implications. How does this work out? And so we'll be back in a second to do that third video.